Good morning, everybody. It's Friday the 13th. Does that scare you guys?
Definitely.
No, I'm not superstitious. Grain markets are higher this morning. We had a USDA report yesterday. Let's kick it off with that.
So, USDA raised its estimate of the U.S. corn crop yesterday. The national yield was pegged at 183.6 bushels per acre, up from 183.1 bushels per acre previously. Harvested acreage was left unchanged at 82.7 million. The crop was estimated at 15.2 billion bushels, which would be the second largest on record behind only last year's 15.3 billion bushel crop. USDA, however, reduced its old crop U.S. carryout by 55 million bushels as a result of better demand, totally offsetting the production increase with regard to the balance sheet. As a result, the 24-25 carryout estimate was reduced slightly. The December 24 corn contract was able to shrug off a trade below $4 per bushel yesterday.
All right. So USDA confirming here that we've got a record corn yield nationally, records in several states: Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Louisiana, Michigan, Mississippi, Nebraska, New York, South Dakota, and Wisconsin, all with the record corn yields. Same thing in soybeans, record yield being projected. Brian, general take homes on the production side of the U.S. balance sheets.
Yeah, I mean, I think the trade thought that the USDA may lower the corn yield a little bit just based on the finishing weather we had in August. So, if the yield wasn't raised that half a bushel, I think we would have had a much more positive reaction. And again, the major revisions were to old crop by way of 15 million bushels of corn for ethanol, and then another 40 million bushels of old crop corn exports. But when you look at a map, a drought monitor, for example, and just look at where we were right at the end of July versus where we were at the end of July last year, it's night and day. So I don't think it's a surprise that we had the ability to have some record crops. And I think I read that for corn, 5 out of the 6 top corn production states are going to have records this year.
Yeah, these are big crops. I understand that there was some late season dryness, and some people are a little frustrated with the record yield estimates because of that. But it appears as if the rains fell in a timely fashion, at least during the month of July. August is maybe debatable. I'm going to show you what I believe to be the scariest soybean chart that I've ever seen, and that would be world ending stocks to use ratio, which is now projected to be even higher than it was during the 18-19 marketing year. So what this chart indicates, if you guys are unfamiliar, is essentially when the number's high, that's bearish. When the number's low, it's bullish. And what this tells you is that ending stocks, the projection is roughly a third of total use, which is very, very high. And this is a very good way to gauge price action. The last time we were this high, Brian, soybeans traded in the $8 to $9 bushel range on the board. I was interested to see if we had ever been this high historically. So I went all the way back to 1964, and we've never been this high. Stocks to use ratio, it's never been this high. How do we fix this?
I mean, really, there's two sides to the balance sheet, Joe. There's the supply and there's the demand, right?
You can fix one of them or both.
I think one of the things that the market had anticipated and counted on just a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, was that we were going to be using a lot more soybeans because we were going to be using a lot more soybean oil for renewable diesel, and that has not been the actual outcome because we've got a lot of used cooking oil that's been used instead in lieu of the soybean oil. And I think that was just a miscalculation by the market. And so I think that is probably over the last year and a half what has led to this situation right here. That in conjunction with the South American crop that continues to get bigger every year. And so that is, to me, then the even scarier thing is when you think about how long it took China to come in and start buying beans this year because of the size of the previous Brazilian harvest. Right now, USDA is just above 150 for the last Brazil crop, and now we're looking at the potential for 169. They were at 153 for the previous Brazil harvest. So even if that 169 turns into, like, let's say 163, and it's not as big as we thought, that is still 10 million tons more than this harvest that we just went through. And think about what that additional 10 million tons could do to the timing of Chinese buying next year, right? So I just think as this Brazilian crop gets bigger and bigger, it's going to push back that time frame when China needs to come to the U.S. to fill that gap between Brazil's harvest, right? So how do you find more demand? I don't know. I don't think anybody's going to really reduce production unless it's driven by low prices.
In the very short term, your best chance to fix this would be a Brazilian weather or crop issue, and we'll get to some of that here in a second. But this is pretty scary stuff. Premium subs. This was my only ad today. You guys have the full versions of all of these stocks to use ratio charts for all crops, U.S. and world, in the email this morning.
A Russian missile allegedly struck a grain vessel in the Black Sea on Thursday morning. This was the first missile attack on a civilian vessel transporting grain since Moscow's invasion back in February of 2022. The ship, which belongs to the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis, was transporting Ukrainian grain to Egypt. The attack occurred in the exclusive economic waters of Romania, an area considered to be international waters. No casualties were reported, and the ship was able to proceed. The wheat market on Thursday did not respond to the attack.
It responded for about 15 minutes, and then it sold off, I think. Here's maybe the more important headline, which was out late yesterday, early this morning. Britain and the U.S. are poised to cross a decisive Rubicon in the Ukraine war on Friday at a White House summit, where they will discuss plans to allow Kiev to strike targets inside Russia with Western-supplied missiles. In a final bid to scare off the West, Putin warned on Thursday evening he would regard such an agreement as tantamount to NATO directly entering the war. Quote, "This will mean that NATO countries, the U.S., and European countries are fighting Russia," he said. So World War III is afoot here, apparently.
I mean, it's
bullish
hard.
wheat.
Well,
Yes, it is.
It is. I mean,
If
one of the things we talked about is that the war going on necessarily just in and of itself is not bullish anymore. And it's led to change in behavior where as Russia continues to need to finance the war, they have to offer wheat at a discount and use that to finance what's happening. And the general thought was that's probably going to be the case unless we start to see something more kinetic that hits whether it's a storage facility or a vessel, right, that's actually carrying agricultural products. And that's going to catch the market's attention. World war, is that bullish? I don't know. I think in the case of world war, I mean, if I'm a fund manager and I've got a bunch of positions on in different markets and all of a sudden we feel like we're in a world war, I'm probably just going to want to get out of everything I'm in.
risk off.
And so what that means, just based on how the fund manager is positioned currently, risk off or taking positions off would mean short covering for corn, soybeans, and wheat, at least initially. But hard to disagree with his view on things, because yes, if you do have Western allies, and I don't, essentially from what I've read is that Joe Biden is very close to making that decision of whether or not to allow Ukraine to use Western weapons. They would not be U.S. weapons, I believe, would be the stipulation. Like, yeah, we're going to give you the go-ahead, but it just can't be U.S. weapons. But from Putin's standpoint, if Ukraine is using Western weapons and they're being used, again, these are essentially NATO forces. You start hearing more talk about Article 5, stuff like that, then it's going to get dicier.
I have a crystal ball on my desk, and what it tells me is that in the comments, somebody will say that we're headed to war because there's an election coming up, and we don't need to discuss that. But that's what somebody's going to say. Anyways.
Okay, so soil moisture in Brazil's key soybean areas has fallen to its lowest point in 3 decades. Low soil moisture in the Brazilian states of Mato Grosso and Parana is causing concern for soybean planting. Together, the two states accounted for about 40% of Brazil's total soybean production last season. Over the next 10 days, dry conditions and above normal temperatures are expected in Mato Grosso. Rainfall in the area is expected to return towards the end of September. Longer-term weather forecasts are calling for rainfall to become more regular in major soybean areas around mid-October.
Here's a good map from our friends at Crop Profit. What rainfall over the last 60 days has been well below normal in key Brazilian soybean growing areas, minus the far south, where they're actually going to catch a whole bunch of rain. The forecast is very wet for the south, but then dry. And if you go to this extended GFS, it does hint at rains returning to key soybean growing areas further north. later this month. Doesn't look like a guarantee, but the abnormal thing, Brian, would be the failure of rains to return.
Yeah, I mean, so the concern is that the area that is dry is the area that was dry last year. Mato Grosso was the predominant area of concern in the previous growing cycle. So, rather regularly, agmarket.net has some weather as part of our Monday meetings that we do. Eric Snodgrass from Nutrien does think that we can have the rains come in October, and if that happens, then this story probably subsides at least for a short period of time. But there's two things, right? The crop has to go in, and then there's going to be a whole other conversation as we get into later in fall, early part of winter. And what is the growing cycle like? What is the moisture like as we're filling the pods, right? So I think you've got with Brazil being the number one soybean exporter in the world, I think you've got a short-term weather event here until it rains, and you're probably going to have another weather event or weather market in a couple months as we really figure out the size of the crop.
Yeah, it's too early to be concerned. You think this could be part of the reason the bean market's held up so well? Is somebody concerned about it?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, I would say so too.
USDA released weekly drought monitor data yesterday. The majority of the Corn Belt experienced hot and dry conditions last week, and drought conditions worsened across much of the area. Soil moisture levels in the southern and eastern portions of the Corn Belt are beginning to show signs of deeper dryness. The High Plains also saw hot and dry conditions last week. However, drought conditions in the region were mostly unchanged compared to the prior week. When we look at the percentage of U.S. areas experiencing drought, corn country 18%, soybeans 26%, winter wheat 57%, spring wheat 22%, and cattle country 29%.
Definitely some problems in like Ohio and the eastern and southern parts of Indiana down into western Kentucky, Tennessee, places like that. Brian, are you hearing anything from customers in those areas?
Yeah, I would say that in general, kind of the thought is that the early corn still good. The concern is going to be for the later corn. Same thing. Early beans look good. Later beans are going to be a concern, and so I guess again we talked about the drought monitor. This is what we did week over week, but I understand that we're going towards more of the growing regions experiencing drought conditions. But when I think about where we were this time last year, again, at the end of July, and then even right now in September versus where we were a year ago, we are leaps and bounds better than we were a year ago, even with the increase in drought conditions that we've seen week to week or over the last couple of weeks. So when I think about the crops that we had last year, it does suggest we still, from a drought monitor perspective, have potential to do quite a bit better than we did last year on crops. And that's what the USDA is suggesting. So what does this make me concerned about right now is the river levels in the Mississippi is going to be a concern. And that is just not something we want to have to deal with again as we're going right into the gut slot of harvest here.
We've had some rain over the last 72 hours associated with the hurricane. There's a little bit more on the radar this morning, but it doesn't appear as if it's going to reach far enough north into the northern parts of the river valley. And actually, the Ohio River Valley is, I think, maybe the more important thing right now. That's where we've seen drought develop, and it's been very dry. And that's a big part of the reason for the low levels on the Mississippi. There's just not any relief in sight. And this is just going to make our soybeans immediately, but corn also less competitive on the export market.
New crop U.S. corn export sales were poor last week. Net corn sales fell below pre-report expectations at 26 million bushels. The print was down 63% compared to the prior week. Mexico was the largest corn buyer for the week. Net soybean sales were near the upper end of expectations at 54 million bushels. The print was down 11% versus the previous week. China was the largest soybean buyer for the week. Net wheat sales were also near the upper end of expectations at 17 million bushels. The print was up 40% from the previous week and up 11% from the prior 4-week average. Taiwan was the largest wheat buyer for the week.
China, noteworthy. China is actually on the board for a tiny, tiny amount of current marketing year corn. I think it was maybe rolled from old crops, so golf clap for that. Soybean commitments to start the marketing year for this current marketing year now are the second worst of the last 10 years. So we've got some work to do there, Brian, and we don't have a lot of time to do it.
No, the Chinese have been in since about mid-July, so let's call it 2 months that they've been coming in and covering needs for soybeans. The question is like, how long do they need to buy,
I
right?
know.
How much do they need to buy to just get them to the next Brazilian harvest? Because I think that again is going to be where they're going to do the majority of their buying, and we're going to be left with a large amount of domestic stocks. So I hope the Chinese continue to buy, but it's going to get interesting because again, we talked about these river levels, and it's going to take more barges to move the same amount of
Mhm.
product. Like you said, it's going to make us less competitive. So that's not something that's going to help us out on the export front. These corn numbers, hopefully it's just a one-off week. We've been running some pretty good totals week to week, but the concern may be is if the export market starts to focus on soybeans and then corn gets kind of put on the back burner. Do we see more of a soybean-centric export market for a little while and then get back to corn? Next spring is when that'll probably be again the dominant program.
Book of corn sales is average to maybe slightly below average relative to the last 10 years to start off. Wheat sales have actually been a bright spot. USDA might be a little bit too low with their wheat export estimate.
We did have a flash sale of corn yesterday. U.S. exporters sold 5 million bushels of corn to unknown destinations for delivery during the 24-25 marketing year. Total U.S. new crop corn export commitments are the fifth best in the last 10 years.
Ryan, prediction time. If you had to guess, will there be any substantial flash sale of corn to China in the next 4 months?
China,
That's the needle mover. That's why I ask. General consensus would be no.
I think in the next 60 days you'll see a monstrous sale to Mexico.
Yes, of
But
course.
China, I don't know. My guess would be no.
Mexico is like a known. We know they're going to probably be our biggest corn buyer. China would be great, but largely unpredictable. What did cattle do yesterday?
They were up. Live cattle were up 22 cents to $1.37 higher. Feeders were up 110 to 225 higher. Box beef was mixed. Choice ended the day at 307.18. That was down 18 cents. Select ended the day at 295.64. That was up $1.26.
Cattle thoughts, Brian?
Cattle is holding support in both feeders and fats right where it needs to. I think the lows that were scored this week, early in the week, are absolutely crucial to hold. If we can get October live cattle back over 180.20, let's just call it, then I think this market's going to see another pop higher and probably rally another $4 or $5. But in lieu of that, if we can't really get substantially back over 180 and we roll back over again, I'm concerned about it. We've talked about that in our charts. The long-term uptrend on the continuous cattle chart has been violated. We got to get back over 180 to fix that. And I read that Australia is increasing their herd size. So they're using, our strong demand and the size of our herd as an opportunity to increase their size of their herd. And we're going to see imports from Australia increase because of that.
Outside markets on Friday morning, U.S. dollars off. Stocks are fractionally higher. Gold's up $14, been very strong. Crude oil is up 76 cents. In the October WTI 69.73. Have a great weekend, guys. Brian, thanks for joining us. We'll be back on Monday.